Migration. Introduction. The African American exodus from the South was a mass migration seen as a deliverance from poverty taking place from 1916 to 1970. The North brought promise through new working opportunities and promoted the idea of racial equality to the impoverished Americans. As they moved to the North, Midwest, and West, cities such as Detroit and Chicago exploded in size. Lead Group claims that Chicago alone had a population of 190,458 people in the 1920s, which skyrocketed to 233,903 people by the 1930s. The Great Migration provided African Americans with the opportunity of creating a name for themselves and created a distinct culture that influenced the economic, political, and societal spheres of the Roaring Twenties.
History. The limitless potential the North offered to the hopeful people of the South was too much to pass up. During this time, environmental factors, societal oppression, and economic possibilities served as catalysts to the Great Migration. According to James A. Smith, the Great Flood of 1927 ravaged the predominantly black South, amounting to more than $1 billion in damages, about one-third of the federal budget. As the Mississippi River flooded more than 70,000 square kilometers of land, more than 700,000 people were left homeless. African Americans dispersed from the damaged areas, claiming precious living space and fueling the century-long hostilities between whites and blacks. Over-reliance on the cotton as a regional economic engine and the institution of slavery led to a slow recovery from the devastating Civil War for the South. Jim Crow was the law of the land, forcing Southern blacks to make their living sharecropping. In Mark Grossman's article, The Ku Klux Klan, he argues, though officially dissolved in 1869, the hate group continued with underground intimidation, violence, and lynchings leading to a period of Southern white supremacy after the Reconstruction era. The 1898 weevil epidemic decimated crops, devastating the South with their reliance on the cotton industry. The reduction of agricultural work combined with the onset of World War I provided an industrial boom in the North, supplying European combatants with artillery and contributed to larger migration streams from the South.
Methods used to draw black labor supply. Labor agents from companies in the North handed out train passes to attract well-built African Americans to work in their factories. The cost of the ticket was taken out of future wages, but provided a tempting alternative to the drudgery of Southern fields. These offers and conditions were spread by word of mouth through Southern communities and were also featured in African American newspapers. According to Isabel Wilkerson, a renowned American journalist with advertisements for housing, employment, and first-hand stories of newfound success in the North, the Chicago Defender became one of the leading promoters of the Great Migration. Besides Chicago, other cities include Detroit, New York City, and Ohio. Churches were very important institutions in the black community, providing a place for people to gather and hear about news from the North.
Methods of migration. During the Civil War, black slaves followed Union troops, escaping from their owners' lands to join the war effort. Antebellum African Americans traveled by the Underground Railroad as tensions between whites and blacks still ran high. Post-war emancipated slaves moved north because of economic opportunity, but many stayed behind because they were poor and had family in the South. Economic causes and repercussions of the Great Migration. The reports of better wages and living conditions were promising enough for blacks to move up north to more industrial urban cities. Smith asserts that the Great Flood of 1927 served as a major impetus for the remaining reluctant African Americans. Many of the 200,000 African Americans that lost their homes had no choice but to relocate for shelter. Many push factors include limitations of sharecropping, farm failures, and crop decimation from weevils. Cleveland, Ohio suffered from increasing population density in black-dominated areas. Half of the white population contributed to white flight, and the city collapsed into black ghettos. The despair of overcrowded cities, poverty, and limited access to quality medical treatment was combated with concentrated hope, creating vibrant black communities that shook the foundation of white American society. After World War I broke out in 1914, industrialized urban areas in the North, Midwest, and West were short on industrial laborers, as European immigration suddenly ceased. The combination of industrial areas of the North's labor shortages with the impoverished conditions of the South led to the Great Migration as the demand for finished goods intensified to supply the war effort. In addition, the northern demand for workers was highlighted by the fact that 5 million men left to serve in the armed forces. Some sectors of the economy were desperate to pay blacks to migrate north. When World War I hit, most blacks were frustrated with a stagnant economy. This led to short, impulsive spurts of migration, fueled by encouraging letters from those who had already migrated. According to Peter Gottlieb's article, Migration and Jobs, the New Black Workers in Pittsburgh, 1916 to 1930, at the beginning of the migration in 1916, the factory wage in the North was 3 times more than what a black would make working in the South. However, rather than immediately finding high-paid, skilled jobs in the work industry, blacks had to settle for lower wages as custodians and blue-collar workers. The main benefit and drawback of the Great Migration was the implementation of black workers into industrial factories. The northern factories offered the new migrants a chance to establish themselves in a strange land. The tremendous amount of new labor available boosted the northern economy to new heights. At the same time, this situation led to many African Americans fighting amongst themselves for residency. Many African Americans saw their plans foiled as they competed amongst themselves over living space, while resisting the racist sentiments of their white neighbors. As a result of housing tensions, many blacks ended up creating ethnic ghettos within larger cities. These enclaves overloaded the threshold available, forcing poorer families out into the streets.
Political causes and repercussions of the Great Migration. Ongoing racial oppression took form in the Jim Crow laws. Although many African Americans moved because of better working conditions, they also wanted access to a world previously accessible only to whites. Compared to the Jim Crow South, where blacks were racially oppressed, blacks in the North got a taste of freedom and independence. The working population gradually shifted from white to black, leading to the demographic transformation of cities like Chicago, Detroit, Harlem, and New York. As the black population exploded in these urban centers, racial divisions and disparities were exposed, leading blacks to be more conscious of their surroundings. Among these included widely documented biases in employment, housing, healthcare, and education. During Reconstruction, African Americans elected 2 black United States senators, 23 congressmen, and more than 100 Southern legislators. Even so, the Democratic Party asserted itself as a dominant racist party in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when whites used property qualifications, poll taxes, literacy tests, and even violence to disenfranchise African Americans, endorsing the Supreme Court's decision of a separate but equal doctrine. Increasing racial violence crushed the African American hope that the promise of true emancipation would soon be fulfilled. By the 1900s, black voters, including the new migrants in the North and West, made civil rights an issue worth prioritizing. By leaving the South, African Americans actively participated in America's democracy, using their presence to force the North to pay attention to the injustices in the South. African Americans rallied to combat these injustices, as blacks in the South did not enjoy equal citizenship with whites, though long since liberated from slavery. In 1910, blacks amounted to 1% of the total population, or 5,741 people. In 1920, the number had grown to 40,838, with the most increase coming after 1917. Before the end of the decade, the population would explode to 7.7%, doubling in size. The thousands of African Americans that migrated to Detroit were part of the Great Migration. In his book, The Great Migration in Historical Perspective, Joe William Trotter argues that before the mass migration, the massive increase of black population allowed the American war economy to blossom. As European powers were locked in bitter conflict, they failed to supply the United States with immigrant labor force. Pittsburgh lacked industrial workers to keep American capitalism on its feet, the city bordering on collapse. The large influx of African American workers in urban centers led to policy changes that restricted black Americans from success. Codes of racial conduct were introduced, barring access to education, working occupations, and opportunity. Before the Exodus, pre-migration northern blacks were arguably more free than post-migration northern blacks. The Great Migration effectively provided African Americans with a short-lived dream, quickly shattered by the harsh reality. Ultimately, the Great Migration could be considered counterintuitive as it reinforced Southern white sentiment in the North. In addition to migrating for jobs, blacks also moved north in order to escape oppressive conditions in the South. Lynchings occurred with or without legal trial. Charles Kenneth Roberts of the University of Alabama encapsulates this unfair legal system in the Norris versus Alabama case, where the Supreme Court ruled that the exclusion of African Americans from jury duty was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The inequality in education and denial of suffrage led to a rise of political activism by African American communities. During the relocation period, African Americans were subject to discrimination under the facade of legality. Southern authorities often arrested migrants under the guise of vagrancy or homelessness and thwarted attempts for northern resettlement. Without black representation in the South, Southern whites had little reason to embrace important racial issues over civil rights and politics.
Social/moral causes and repercussions of the Great Migration. The Great Migration caused a moral awakening for many African Americans by giving them new perspectives on equal treatment. Black Americans believed that they deserved the same status as white Americans, motivated by notable differences in societal institutions, migration experiences, and racial attitudes. Class and gender became factors that contributed to personal identity and place perception in the new environment of the North. Some African Americans believed migration would secure full citizenship rights that were denied in the South. Mobility equated to freedom for enslaved blacks. The development of a unique Black American culture led to the emergence of the church as a pivotal leader in communal and spiritual guidance. In Milton C. Thurnan's A Heaven All Their Own, he observes that in Harlem's 150 blocks alone, there are 140 churches among those streets. The African American population boom led to an era of spiritual enlightenment in which new Christian denominations sprung up with new ideologies and new perspectives. The church services changed to adapt for the bleak life in the South. Hymns and texts were changed to represent God's deliverance from the evils of enslavement. Religion reached new heights during the early 20th century, playing an integral part of African American communities and redefined the role it had played in the South. The Harlem Renaissance also blossomed from the Great Migration as it was an artistic, cultural, and literary movement that revolutionized the Roaring Twenties. Alain Locke described it as the Negro life seizing its first chances for group expression and self-determination. White Americans were so fascinated by the literary works and visual arts of African Americans that they actively sought out black writers. This caused the publishing industry to boom because the writers would often write about a realistic portrayal of their life. This created a sense of black identity and continued all throughout the 1920s. Although this movement influenced many future black writers, it was later disregarded by the literary establishments in the 1930s. After the Civil War, however, the movement gained immense recognition again through the literary works which depicted the ghetto realism and black lives during the 1920s. Along with the evolution of black customs came a growing sense of racial consciousness among the American people. Alan DeSantis asserts that during this time period, 50 new black periodicals were created and black press became a more effective weapon for the community's struggle against racism. The Great Migration not only emphasized economic opportunity and higher moral standards, but also paved the road for future black Americans. Undoubtedly, music was another stimulus for the African American push for equality. The Harlem Renaissance brought a new style of music called jazz to the ears of Americans, capturing the journey north in the unconventional instrumental ideas the novel music encouraged. At its height, jazz music became the defining cultural movement of the 1920s. It influenced the youth of the era from clothing style to slang to attitude. For that reason, jazz became the main musical score used in films, while nightclubs became valuable commodities and social hubs. In these nightclubs, American youth immersed themselves in a growing nightlife, including a new dancing style led by increasingly popular jazz music. Jazz served to allow the public to express themselves like never before. Specifically, flapper women of the 20s were unique as they sported short in their haircuts and dresses, the clothing and dance reflecting the new attitudes they adopted during the 20s. Aside from jazz's influence on the American public, prosperous African Americans used their disposable income to buy records, aiding the rapid spread of jazz music through the region. The musical advancements of jazz encompassed freedom songs, which were socially and politically conscious of Black oppression. These songs served as rallies for equal rights and produced what would later be known as the Civil Rights Movement.
Conclusion. By the end of the Great Migration in 1970, the demographic impact was unmistakable. In the 1920s, 90% of African Americans lived in the South, and 75% of those blacks lived on farms. By 1970, 47% of African Americans lived in the North and West, and only 25% of Southern blacks lived on rural farms. The Great Migration spawned an awakening and heightened the importance of the church for many African American communities. It gave them a new perspective of their unbounded potential in a predominantly white American society. The diaspora of African American people revealed the flaws in America's racist society, of which some are still present. Police brutality across the U.S. and the unjust documented mass incarceration of African Americans dominate national headlines as these issues continue to be unresolved. The Great Migration produced extreme population changes, resulting in America's current demographics, and generated an era where the fight against discrimination took center stage. A profound impact on the early 20th century, the Great Migration brought a new Black culture, charged with Southern history, searching to seize the opportunity of the North.